Okay, this is an interview with Juan Tejeda of the Conjunto Aztlan and also founder of the Conjunto Festival in San Antonio, Texas. And we are in San Antonio, and it is Tuesday, the 18th of August, 1909, 2009.
1909.
Let's start off with a little bit of history. Tell me about your background, where you were raised, and what the early musical influences on you.
Well, I was born right here in San Antonio, Texas, 1953, October 27th. And my father, my uncles played a little bit of music, guitarra, cantaban. My father always wanted one of his sons or his daughter to play the accordion. And he tried it with my older sister, my brother, but it didn't take. And so I was the next one in line. And when I was 9 years old, he wanted to take me to learn from Santiago Jimenez, Flaco's father, and Santiago Jr.'s father. But he was living in Dallas at the time, but he saw in the phone book Santiago Jimenez, so we went to this house, and it was actually his son, Santiago Jimenez Jr., who was a very young, just up-and-coming musician at that time. I think he was like 19 years old. And he told my father, well, if I can teach him, if he wants to learn. So he started giving me lessons, and he charged my father $3 for every tune that I learned. I didn't even have an accordion then. I was here on the west side of San Antonio. And after that, when I was like 11, 12 years old, my cousin started playing in one of his first conjunto bands. They played drums and guitar, and then I began playing after my cousin left drums with Santiago Jimenez Jr. and his conjunto. Get up and play the accordion every now and then, different places. And I left it, and very traumatic after about 2 or 3 years that I played with him, left playing in the conjunto band and even stopped playing the accordion for a number of years. Every now and then I'd pick it up at home. But it was very kind of a traumatic situation, I was getting 13 years old or so, and rock and roll era. And
I was going to ask you about that because Texas has the tradition of the conjunto going all the way back to the mid-30s and early 40s. But by the 50s, if you want to be hip and you want to be cool, the accordion is kind of like old-fashioned, isn't it?
It was. And that was part of the attitude. Now we're talking about, it's going into the 60s.
Let me just interrupt you for a second. If you could rephrase my question, whenever I ask you a question,
sure.
Rephrase it when you start your answer. So if I say, when did you start robbing banks, you can say, I started robbing banks.
Yeah.
So going back to this, was it a little corny and considered a little old-fashioned?
Yeah, actually, back then in the, I guess, early 60s it was when I began playing the accordion. Playing the accordion was kind of old-fashioned, was kind of corny. It was this rock and roll has really taken hold, right? And then once like I was 12, 13 years old when I left the conjunto band, then I was really starting to get into my rock and roll here. But it was more than just corny and it being la música de tus jefes, de tus padres, and old-fashioned and corny. There was something else that I didn't understand at the time. There was this real sort of negativity attached to it, and almost a racist thing attached to it that I came to analyze later on. But that it was almost inferior music. You know what I mean?
I've heard that there's been this discussion that the conjunto, when it developed, was kind of viewed as being appreciated by the lower class people, and that what Beto Villa calls the high tone, while the orquestra was more appreciated by the gente de razón, if you will, middle class, if you will. Was that? Did you feel that sensibility?
And yeah, I think there was always this attitude attached to conjunto music, because obviously conjunto music is music of the working class. In that sense, the lower class, and the poor people, la gente del rancho, and so that was part of the whole attitude against conjunto music. But there was something else. It was more to it to that. It was I really believe later on I analyzed it that it was just this whole a very institutionalized racism that existed in a lot of ways still exists against our people and our culture in general. I mean, why, for instance, even back then in grade school, when I was playing conjunto music, 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, even then I had what called the taco syndrome, right? Where my mom would pack tacos, you know, papas con huevo and tortillas for me to take to lunch, you know, or frijoles or something. And I was embarrassed of it, you know, and everybody had white bread bologna sandwiches or whatever. And I used to hide and go eat it. And same thing like speaking Spanish. And even at that time, we were still, you know, even with nuns here, we were punished for speaking Spanish in school. So there was this general making us as Chicanos, right, feel that our culture, our language, our music, our food was like inferior, right? It gave us this sort of inferiority complex, you know. So if my language and my culture and my music and my food and my father, porque era más prieto, you know, is inferior, then I'm inferior, right? So there was this internalization in a sense, and I think it's an experience that a lot of Chicanos, you know, go through. They made us feel that we were inferior, and this is this whole colonization, right?
So you're grappling with it at 12, 13, 14
Yeah,
years
and
old.
I quit the band. And I was grappling because I never played it at school, right? I was kind of embarrassed of it. And although I was making money and helping out my parents, which was important, I'd play on weekends. And you know, still, whatever I made, 10, 15, 20 bucks, you know, it all helped, you know, back then, early 60s. And I remember distinctly, you know, crying when I left the conjunto because it was a big conflict within me, you know, and I told my parents, you know, I was just 12, 13 years old, just kind of going into, beginning to go into puberty and rock and roll, you know, with my friends, and that over here on the side, you know, conjunto music on the weekends, which was a great experience in retrospect, but at the time it created a big conflict with me, so much so that I left it. And I didn't really, every now and then I'd play during high school at some of the family gatherings, you know, but pretty much left it. In high school then, I played in a few rock bands, right? Chicago style bands and Stone Creek and, you know, the 60s and the whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll, the whole hippie movement and everything, which was interesting. So I played in a couple of rock bands, just played occasionally, and it wasn't until I got into college then, graduated from here at Central Catholic High School in San Antonio, and went to the University of Texas at Austin for the first time away from home, that then I really got involved in the Chicano Movement, 1972. And it was still very much happening, you know, here in Texas and at UT Austin. And then is when I got involved, started taking all these Chicano studies courses, right? Eventually majored and got my degree in Chicano studies. But then is when my sort of consciousness came into being, you know, about who I was really in my identity, my cultural identity, my music, my history, and found out, you know, in the educational system what was really going on and analyzed my whole situation. Then after that, I brought the accordion back and picked it up again. And then in about 1974, 75, and began what would soon thereafter, within a couple of years or so, become the Conjunto Aslan.
Let's go back just for a moment. You know, the accordion, this instrument, quite apart from all the politics, quite apart from all the who's who, and quite apart from your father wanting you to play, what did it feel like when you first started those early rehearsals, those early lessons with Santiago Jimenez Jr. to you? What was there something special about the accordion that maybe wasn't the guitar or some other instrument?
It was, and my parents tell me that I was always very musical, right? Even when I was very young, that I would go around singing all the time, and I would imitate and mimic, you know, TV and radio, and they knew I was musical. But when my father first took me to learn how to play the accordion, and I didn't have a button accordion. I was Santiago Jr., he would lend it to me during the lessons. But immediately there was a connection between me and the accordion and that particular type of music. I think partly because my parents listened to it and would take us even when we were young to the bailes acá in Torres Place on the south side, and different bailes and weddings. So we heard it as part of our cultura, right? The accordion then is, for me, and since that time, was always a very special instrument. Even though it didn't originally come from our culture. We, as Mexicanos right here in Texas and in Mexico, adopted it from the German settlers that brought it over, right, and other European settlers. The accordion, the button accordion, right, accordion de botón, which is different from the piano accordion, a different technique of playing it. You know, it's more akin to the harmonica, the in and out, right, the bellows, than to the piano and the piano accordion. Outside of the bellow action, completely different technique of playing the button accordion from the piano accordion.
While we're at it, let's go back for a moment and let's talk about this origin of the accordion here in Texas. I've heard a couple of versions of it. One is that the accordion came up from Nuevo León, but the one that I find a little bit more understandable is I know that in the 1850s there were immigrants that were coming from Bavaria, and they would dock in New Orleans. And then there was a guy that would take them through a guide through to Texas, or through California, I think. And one boatload landed, and there was no guide. The guy had ripped them off. And so a la brava, they decided to find California themselves. They wound up in Texas, and I understand that's the founding of New Brownsville. But these Bavarians brought with them the accordion. Could you talk about that? And the influence, like how did that get into our music?
Well, you know, the accordion was introduced according to various sources, Manuel Peña being one of the major sources of conjunto and música tejana in general. He says about the German settlers coming in via Monterrey and setting up the famous German brewmasters. And of course, should we just let that ring, or should we?
Do you have your machine on? Do you have your machine on?
I think I do. Should I just should I turn it off somehow? So
yeah. So you were saying about the origin of the
yeah, well, the introduction of the accordion, the button accordion here into Texas and Mexico, you know, according to Manuel Peña, he says that you know, there are two sort of logical choices. One would being Monterrey, where a lot of the German brewmasters, and there was a German colony that came up there and down there, and of course they brought their instruments and all their language and culture and everything. So the accordion came with them. And then also there was a very large up here, sort of north in Fredericksburg and New Braunfels and in San Antonio itself, a large German population in the 20s, you know, in the late 1800s into the early 1900s, even into, you know, 1930s, for instance, right here in this area where I live, in San Antonio, on the south side of San Antonio, the Harlandale School District. My mother said that when she went to high school, and she did, they didn't graduate, but my mom almost graduated. They just went to the 11th grade then. He said they were all Germans, Mexicanos. So she was one of only about 4 or 5 Mexicanos going to Harlandale High School here in the 1930s. And now it's all pura raza, man, you know what I mean? But back then, so they talk about big German settlements up here more than the north, and then Monterrey, and that confluence of that brought the accordion. The Mexicanos then adopted it from the settlers.
Now the accordion that they brought, was it the piano accordion?
The button.
Yeah, they brought the button.
They brought the button.
Tell me the difference between the button and the other.
The piano accordion, the same keyboards as a piano, and you play it the same way you play a piano. If you play the piano, you can play a piano accordion. It's just with air, in and out. Also the difference, there's another major difference in that the piano accordion, such as other chromatic accordions, you play in and it's the one button, it's the same sound. You play it out, it's the same key, it's the same note. The button accordion, by the time you play it in, you get one key, one note, out, it's a different note. Completely different technique from playing the piano. The buttons and the combination of buttons for chord combinations, major and minor scales and everything, completely different from playing the piano. The only thing that's the same about playing the piano accordion and the button accordion is that they use bellows in and out. But here again, going in and out on the piano, it's the same note, and not so on the button accordion. So completely different technique.
So somewhere between, say, the 1920s and the late 30s, the accordion gets adopted by Mexicanos.
Actually, the accordion gets adopted by the Mexicanos from the German settlers much earlier, from like 1860s, 1870s, all the way up into the 1890s, and at the turn of the century. So already in the late 1800s, the accordion was being introduced here into Texas and Mexico, you know, which, of course, it had just become part of the United States in 1845, right, Texas. But prior to 1836 was still Mexico aquí. So yeah, it was introduced in the late 1800s, but by the turn of the century then, it really then began to take hold and supplanted other instruments such as the violin and the guitarra as the main instrument within the Mexicano celebrations here in Texas and in northern Mexico. Right?
What do you think was the appeal? Why that instrument and not the others, and the popularity?
It was relatively cheap, and thus I think part of the reason why it became, and not just here in Texas and with the Mexicanos, but worldwide.
Let me remind you to incorporate my question into your answer.
I think that the reason why the accordion took hold here amongst our raza and became like the instrument and the music for our celebrations and for our people, right, was because, for one, it was relatively cheap. You know, it started out as a single row button accordion and then a single row bass notes, right, the melody and bass side, and then moved to a 2-row, then moved to a 3-row, then it moved through a chromatic like 5-row. The button accordion doesn't have the complete sharps and flats that a piano does. So that's another basic difference. It's incomplete music. It's like a harmonica. You don't get all the sharps, flats. You get a lot of them, but not everything, you know. So anyway, so the instrument was relatively cheap. One person could play the melody side and accompany themselves, right? And the polka, for instance, in the late 1800s, the polka became like the popular dance salon music, and like really took the whole world by storm. It was like rock and roll later, right? You know, here we had, you know, before that we had all these prim and proper people dancing these waltz and minuets and stuff. And then the polka comes along, and then these people start dancing and beer drinking, right? And a celebration of the people. You know, the accordion is really worldwide in a lot of different countries and nations, and interesting enough, it almost at every place it is, it's like working class music. I know because we started out here at the International Accordion Festival a number of years ago and still going on, and we have cultures and people that play the accordion from all over the world. You know, Italy, Germany, Czechoslovakia, Poland, Germany, Ireland, Africa, Colombia, and then the different types of accordion, because there's concertinas, there's bandoneones, like with tango music down. There's the 3-row, there's a chromatic accordion, there's a piano accordion. China, the piano accordion is almost like the national instrument of China. So partly it became very popular because it was working class music. Instrument was relatively cheap. One person could play and accompany themselves. Very lively, happy, danceable music, that took hold here. And not only here, but throughout the world. The polka, as I mentioned, beautiful waltzes, chotices, very different rhythms that came with the accordion. The polkas, the valses, the chotices, the redovas, right, the mazurkas, and some very beautiful music. So it took root in our community, and of course then we adapted it and created something distinctive with it. both a unique original American musical ensemble that we now know as a conjunto, in northern Mexico known as by música norteña, right, or conjunto norteño, but here we know it as just conjunto music, right? And a distinctive style of music that's also called conjunto here. So conjunto refers to the ensemble, the distinct original American musical ensemble that we created, but also a distinctive style of music that's known as conjunto also.
And what comprises a conjunto ensemble? Where are the instruments and the players?
The basic conjunto ensemble is comprised of the lead accordion instrument, usually the button accordion, although there are examples of piano accordions within conjunto music also. Right now there's Michael Salgado, who's become very, very popular within the last 10 years. Excuse me. But usually, for the most part, the button accordion is the principal main instrument. Then the main companion instrument is the bajo sexto, which is a 12-string bass rhythm guitar. Little bigger box, thicker strings, tuned differently from a regular 12-string guitar, richer melodic, rhythmic, more mid to low strings, right, instead of the high guitar strings, which is the principal companion instrument to the accordion. And then as the music evolved from the 20s into the 30s, into the 40s, they introduced stand-up bass, the tololoche, then later when music went electric, the electric bass, and then added the drums because now you had amplified music. Before amplification into late 40s and early 50s, if you had the drums, it would drown out everything else. So it makes sense, you know, natural sort of. But that's the basic four-piece conjunto ensemble. Button accordion, bajo sexto, bass and drums. Other conjuntos sometimes would use guitar instead of bajo sexto. More progressive conjuntos that as the music has evolved into the 60s, 70s, 80s, and now to the present, sometimes then added keyboard, synthesizers, saxophone, percussion instruments. But the basic traditional conjunto ensemble, accordion, bajo sexto, bass, and drums.
Now, the conjunto, as we know it today, started to evolve in the mid-30s. Manuel Peña talks about Narciso Martinez's recording of La Chicharronera as one of the first recordings. And then you have people, there's Narciso, there's Santiago Jimenez Sr., there's Pedro Ayala, there's others that began to evolve. Tell me about this evolution and how different instruments and different styles began to emerge.
Well, in the evolution of conjunto music, it became more pronounced and the way our distinct, and by our Mexicano, Chicano, distinctive style of ensemble, as I mentioned, but also a style of music evolved after the turn of the century into the 1910s and the 1920s, which then our music started to take a distinctive shape and form, beginning with people like primarily Narciso Martinez, and when then he incorporated the bajo sexto with Santiago Almeida as his bajista. Once the accordion was paired with the bajo sexto, that was the beginning of a new American original ensemble, because this was a meeting of like the old world and the new world in a sense. The accordion from the old world. The bajo sexto was a Spanish Mexican adaptation of a 12-string guitar, right, that came via Mexico. And once you combine the accordion with the bajo sexto, that was the beginnings of the new ensemble that we now know as conjunto music, because the Europeans didn't have that combination, right? Okay, that was a very important pairing. And then as it evolved instrumentally, moving into the 30s, and I think it was Santiago Jimenez Sr. and Manuel Peña credits Santiago with introducing the stand-up bass, the tololoche, into conjunto music in the 30s, in one of his early recordings. Now, there were early recordings that were done in the 20s, preceding the 1934-1935 recording, the Narciso Martinez, La Chicharronera. And Manuel Peña kind of makes mention, but not really. He kind of marks Narciso as being like the father of conjunto music because of certain things that he did that departed from earlier accordeonistas. and the pairing with Santiago Almeida. But there were recordings as early as 1928 within what now has become the more conjunto tradition, okay? Even though it had a more European flavor, but you could always already see the beginnings. In fact, I'm trying to remember his name now, I can't think of it. Bruno Villarreal in 1928, El Azote del Valle, the Whip del Valle. That preceded Narciso by a good 6-7 years in terms of recording. And the early ethnic recordings that existed, many of them were done here in San Antonio, right? And of which Lidia Mendoza and then subsequently Narciso Martinez and Santiago Jimenez all recorded during the 30s also here. But the reason that Narciso Martinez is known as the father of conjunto music is because he then developed a very distinctive style of playing that departed from the European style. And as Manuel Peña says, then stopped playing the bass chords and left the bass and the rhythm accompaniment to the accordion to the bajo sexto, right? So he's focused then on just the melody side and developed a very distinctive, rapid style, again, that departed from the European style of playing. So that's why that Narciso is distinctive in that sense. And then with the pairing of Santiago Almeida, beginning of the new American original ensemble and style of music. So Manuel Peña marks that as a very important point. As we evolve, we added the Tololoche, Santiago Jimenez, excuse me. Later on into the 40s, Valerio Longoria is credited with introducing the drums into conjunto music, the bolero, the Cuban bolero. Everything that was done early on was all instrumental. There was no singing within conjunto music. And we played sitting down. And there's a very practical reason for that, you know, is that early accordions didn't have straps, shoulder straps. They used to use, now I already took it off, but usually I have a thumb strap here. So when you're going out, you know, you had to, first of all, since you didn't have shoulder straps, you needed to sit down to brace it on here, right? And then you had this thumb strap, so when you're going out, you could hold it. So it wouldn't just pull out of your hand, right? You needed something to brace it. So when you're going in, you can use this here and play it, right? But when you're going out, you needed that thumb strap. So interesting, you know, minor things that you think are minor, like just during the 50s, right, the late 40s and 50s, they added these straps so that then you could play it here and then stand up and play for the first time instead of sitting down. All of the early conjunto music was instrumental, and it was Valerio Longoria that then began singing in the late 40s on his recordings. So introduced sort of vocal music to conjunto music, because prior to that it was all instrumental.
What about the conjunto Bernal? I understand that it was important contributor as well.
And as we evolve, there have been a number of people and innovators that have added some very important things to the style, to the genre, both in terms of repertoire and in terms of just innovations. I mean, we talked about introducing then the electric bass, then the standard trap drum set became part of the standard conjunto ensemble, because once amplification came in, now you could play for larger audiences, right, in halls, and the drums weren't as noisy, right, because we had amplified accordion and voices and didn't drown out all the other instruments, right? So it became part of the standard 4-piece traditional conjunto ensemble: accordion, bajo sexto, bass, and drums. Vocals then, 2- and 3-part harmonies. And actually, people like then, Valerio Longoria was one of the great innovators in conjunto music, stylistically developed a completely different style of playing music than any of his predecessors. You know, I mean, he came from Narciso Martinez and Pedro Ayala, but then developed a completely different style that was known as Valerio. The tuning of his accordions changed dramatically, and he started to alter the reeds, change reeds, make them hoarser, octave them, what he called octavación. He introduced singing, drums. Tony de la Rosa, then another figure, very important, slowed down the tempo of the music, very staccato style of playing, distinctive style. introduced some very good singers. Esteban Jordan, then right at this period, and Conjunto Bernal were more like the progressive, and they really took it from Valerio to a totally whole new level of progressive accordion playing. Paulino Bernal and Esteban Jordan that then introduced, you know, blues and jazz and Latin American rhythms into conjunto music. Valerio had already introduced like the bolero, right? And a lot of people don't know this, but I firmly believe, and though it hasn't been documented, that it was Valerio who introduced the cumbia, besides the bolero, because Valerio told me himself later on, because after that I hired him as the first master accordion instructor at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, and we became very good friends, that he used to have a shortwave radio, and he would pick up the vallenato and cumbia music from Colombia, and he would take it out right from the shortwave radio. They were playing it over the radio, right? And though it hasn't been documented, you have to go back and look at the old recordings. But the repertoire then began to expand, right? The Cuban bolero, the Colombian cumbia, and then they, being Chicanos, right, Mexicans now within the United States, we were heavily influenced by country music, by blues, by rock and roll. As we move into the 50s and the 60s, well, you know, we're here. You know, we're obviously influenced by the major media, right? And that those influences are important influences. And we began playing blues and jazz and rock and roll and taking it to another level. And Paulino Bernal from the Conjunto Bernal and Esteban Jordan, I think especially, took it in that direction. Rhythm blues, rock, jazz, and integrating that into polkas and cumbias, you know, and then adding salsa and other Latin influences that took our music just to another sort of real world level. Now, a lot of the traditionalists now, because by that time, by the 50s and 60s, it had become very much a part of our culture, and our raza didn't like this whole progressive. The young people did, but a lot of the very traditional one is still just the traditional old polkas and boleros and valses and chotices, right? The way the tradition started within our culture. But they're always going to have those mavericks that push the limits, and I think that's very important too. And so Paulino Bernal was one of the introduced the chromatic accordion to conjunto music, 3-part harmony from like the Trio Los Panchos, rhythms from Latin America and jazz and blues, and he was always trying to do something different, and so was Esteban Jordan. And it's very natural that our music would go this route, because we as Chicanos, we are this mestizaje, right? This mestizo. We are a fusion, a hybrid culture, parte Indio-Americano, parte Español, Mexicano, Mexican in the United States, right? And obviously been influenced by all these different cultures, U.S. culture and music and world culture and music, and that our music and all of our folklore and our cultural and artistic expressions, you know, reflect this synthesis. We're this hybrid culture, and our music and conjunto music has, we're a German, European accordion instrument with a Mexican, Spanish, bajo sexto instrument combined with the fusion, right? And then bringing in the Cuban bolero. That's weird. I thought that this would shut it off, and it obviously didn't. Narciso to Esteban musically. Well, Narciso.
Let's get that. David, when you come back. You coming around? Come on, holding up the show, Holmes. yeah, start it that way from Narciso to Esteban.
Okay.
Ready?
Are you ready? Oh, so you want me to demonstrate the evolution from Narciso to Esteban Jordan? That's a hell of a thing to do real quick here. But, you know, there are a lot of basic differences, you know. Back in the early days, the polkas were very fast, you know, and then they started to slow it down with Valerio, and Antonio La Rosa completely slowed it down. I mean, I'm talking like Narciso Martinez. Right? Real fast kind of polkas. Whereas now, people play that same polka after a Tone de la Rosa. Now Chicanos, the part of the way we developed even our dancing, you know, from Germanic and European style of playing and Polish style of playing, very, very fast polkas, to then our own distinctive style of dancing, which became known as more the tacuachito, right? Instead of jumping around real ribald, you know, then we kind of took a little sliding and shuffling, right? To like. Right? So the tempo was a very important sort of stylistic change that occurred over here. But then in terms of repertoire, you know, again, as I said earlier, early conjunto music was all instrumental, and then they added vocalization, added the Cuban bolero, added the Colombian cumbia, then all kinds of other influences that were involved here. I mentioned country, which is big within conjunto and Tejano music in general. Then adding blues, rock, you know, with the rock and roll and rock licks, jazz licks, other Latin American influences, you know. So we had, for instance, something that Esteban Jordan, for instance, then later on, as he moved into the 40s, into the 50s, and into the 60s then, with the whole sort of rock revolution, and Esteban being the maverick and the genius that he is, started adding all kinds of blues and rock and jazz influence and Latin, salsa. We're doing some, I mean, Esteban do some. Right? Kind of rock, blues, jazz, even sort of Cajun, Zydeco, right? So adding those influences, because we grew up with them here, listening to mainstream radio, you know, doing rock and roll now, but in cumbias, doing rhythm and blues, like when he did, you know, You'll Never Get to Heaven If You Break My Heart, right, in a polka, and with horns and accordion, just some amazing, real jazzy influences. Blues kind of riffs that you get into, right? So we are this synthesis, as I said before, this musical fusion, a hybrid culture that we pick and choose from these and create something new, a new ensemble, a new style of music.
Yeah, hablando de eso, what is the difference between the conjunto, and you mentioned horns before, and the orquesta? How did that evolve?
The Orquesta Tejana now, and here again, Manuel Peña is the principal source for both the conjunto and the Orquesta Semana. There have been other Orquesta Tejana, there have been other important scholars, but I think that Manuel Peña is the most important scholar. And the theories that he set forth that contextualize our music and our music role and social and symbolic and cultural significance are very important. I don't think there's been any other theoretician that has applied these theories to our music and the importance of our music to our people. States that then the conjunto started out in the ranchos, right, at the turn of the century, late 1800s, introduced the accordion, evolved into the 20s and the beginning of our recordings and really taking hold as part of our culture and like the instrument for our celebrations, the music, the ensemble, the evolution of the ensemble amongst the working class into the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, culminating with Esteban Jordan and the Conjunto Bernal, that it reached its kind of peak as an ensemble and with the incorporation of these different elements into the repertoire. And as a very important cultural and identifying symbol for our people, right? You know, this represents who we are, right? This is our music. This is something that we created, right? This is a hybrid music, just like we're a hybrid people, right? And this is very much a part of our identity, our culture, our people. So that's all very important. The orquesta then had a sort of a parallel development more into the 20s and 30s when the Orquesta Tejana first started out. And like even here in Texas, there were a lot of Chicanos in high school that learned how to read music, right? Football is big in Texas, right? So the marching bands, right? So learn how to read. So there were a lot of Chicanos that began playing horns, you know, saxophone, trumpets, clarinets and everything. And based on the big band tradition, which kind of took the whole US and the world by storm during the 20s, right? 20s and 30s and into the 40s, right? World War II.
Let me interrupt you there. We'll allow this thing to
we have another.
going into the move, so that would justify what we're hearing.
Mm-hmm.
But then the damn thing kept moving, so we wound up having the spirit with a pin, and then we had to hide the pin with a leaf. And it got to be this funny thing, you know. We finally did it. Finally got it. All right, you were saying, I'm sorry, about the orchestra, how the orchestra came out.
Well, now the Orquesta Tejana, we have to understand that Tejano music has become like this larger rubric under which we can then apply certain music that we as Mexicanos in Texas created. And Americo Paredes, famous, you know, very important Chicano academic and folklorist that passed away a number of years ago, counted as part of Música Tejana the corrido tradition, the New World corrido tradition, because he says that we actually here on the border between U.S. and Mexico in Texas created the New World corrido tradition based on the fact that the earliest uncovered corrido that we have is the corrido de Juan Cortinas, right? And that was right after the U.S.-Mexico War in 1848, and there were segments of that that were recovered of fragments of that corrido. 50, 60 years before the greater Mexican revolutionary corridos of 1910 to 1921, right here in Texas, we already had the beginning of a distinctive corrido tradition. So Manuel Peña and him kind of consider part of Tejano music. But then that we've created two distinctive American original ensembles, the conjunto being one, as I said, button accordion based, and the Orquesta Tejana being another one, and styles of music, styles of related music, the conjunto style and the Orquesta Tejana style. The Orquesta Tejana then came into being more as a result of in the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, the big band era, right, in U.S. that kind of swept the U.S., the swing era and the big band tradition, everybody sitting down reading music. And in Texas, there's a big football base here, right, and in high schools, the marching band. So a lot of Chicanos learn how to read and write music, right, in the marching band. So then they got integrated into some of these larger orchestras, right, sit-down orchestras that would play at highfalutin sort of functions, because obviously the poor raza, la plebe, couldn't afford to hire a very big, so orquestas, right, that had maybe 15 to 25 or more sometimes performers, right, cost a lot. So only the people that had money could really afford to pay these orquestas. Nonetheless, Chicanos were performing in these orquestas, right, suited up, reading the music, performing at these high society functions. Little by little, then, these Chicanos started forming smaller bands and condensing the big horns and brass and woodwind sections into like maybe 2 or 3 horns and a rhythm section, bass, drums, guitar, maybe keyboard, and adding a trumpet, a sax, and maybe a trombone, or 2 trumpets and a sax, or 2 saxophones and a trumpet, right? To make it more affordable for la raza, right? Instead of having a 15, 25 piece band that you had to pay a whole lot more. And originally, the bands that were playing in the bigger orchestras were playing a more American music, if you will, big band type of repertoire, you know, in the mood, and occasionally would integrate a bolero, a cumbia, a Latin American rhythm, right? Little by little, the repertoire then for these orquestas changed from more big band jazz, if you will, to a more Latin American repertoire. And then once the orquestas began playing the more of the conjunto repertoire that had really become first and it was the first, like really our original music, if you will, the conjunto amongst the working class, the polkas, the valses, the chotis, the redobas, and then canciones, right? Canciones vals, canciones in polka time, polka rancheras, and then the bolero was integrated by Valerio Longoria, and then the cumbia. Then the orquesta started playing polkas, but with a little more jazzed up arrangements and the horns instead of the accordion. Then they started playing the boleros and the cumbias, right? A little more Latin jazz, Latin salsa, right? So the conjunto and the orquesta repertoire approximated itself, except the instrumentation was different. The conjunto had the accordion as the lead instrument, the orquesta had the horns, right? And they had a little more jazzy arrangements, but the repertoire was almost the same. And always, even within the conjunto tradition, I mean, there's examples throughout our history and recorded history that we were playing, you know, so-called American music also. I mean, Narciso Martinez recorded a foxtrot, you know what I mean? Valerio Longoria was recording in English and country music also, you know, way back. And Esteban Jordan, you know, translating rhythm and blues and the Righteous Brothers and other things into polkas and cumbias, you know, and bilingual. Well, the orquesta was doing more jazzy arrangements to polkas, and then they had cumbias, and then they would play a rock and roll number, right? They play as we evolved into the 60s and 70s, then a Chicago number with horns, and they'd play a lot of more sort of rock and roll and rhythm and blues, right? I remember the dances right here, like at St. James and St. Francis, where they had people like the Latin Breed and the Royal Jesters performing, and they do a lot of cover tunes, right? Top 40 and other rock and roll numbers. Then they throw in a polka and a cumbia and a bolero. And little by little, the repertoire shifted to they were playing more polkas, cumbias, boleros to rock and roll. But they were doing it with horns, with jazzier arrangements, right? From more English to a small amount of Spanish music, to then the opposite, the way it evolved over into the 60s, into the 70s. And I think a lot had to do with the advent of the Chicano movement of the 60s and the whole civil rights movement, that the repertoire sort of changed. We then became more aware of who we were. We took more pride, and I was talking about, right, in our culture as a result of the whole, you know, nationalistic, cultural, Chicano cultural renaissance of the 60s and 70s, going back to our roots and who are we, and taking pride and kind of countering all of the negative attitudes against our culture and our people and our music, right? That this is low-class music, conjunto or orquesta, right? And we took that pride. So then the repertoire shifted, right? Sort of natural from more English language, rock and roll cover and R&B, to Spanish, right? And now we're proud of who we are. So the Chicano movement was very important on a lot of levels for our artistic and cultural expressions, right?
So, enter Conjunto Atlan and yourself. You come onto the scene, you're aware, certainly, of all of this long tradition going back to Narciso. You're aware of the orchestra sound that by now has been established with groups like Little Joe, Sunny and the Sun Glows. And let me ask you two questions. One, you get motivated to create your own group.
Mm-hmm.
How do you go about creating a group? And when you ask yourself, what am I going to play? How do you answer that question given this long tradition, given your political awareness, your Chicanismo, and given the fact that you must at that point also say, I'm part of this long road of music. How did you deal with that?
Well, I dealt with coming to terms with my identity and my music and my culture and my history for the first time once that I left high school and went up to UT Austin for the first time in 1972 as a little freshman over there at this big old white university where Chicanos were less than 1/2% of the student population. So we all gravitated towards each other. And for the first time, I took Chicano history and Chicano lit courses and began to learn about myself and my history and what was our position here in the United States, right? This opened my eyes. And as I said earlier, the Chicano movement, part of the larger civil rights movement, was really in its heyday in 1972, at least here in Texas, you know, and would be throughout the 70s, you know, towards the end of the 70s. So I was thrust into that, and immediately, you know, because we were so few at UT Austin, we all just became involved in the movimiento, and really that's where we became aware in a lot of ways, developed this political consciousness, and also this consciousness of who we are and what our history was, because we studied it for the first times in our lives. They didn't teach us this in grade school and high school, you know. We had to get into college, and that was the beginning of the whole Chicano studies, you know, courses in the early 70s. It just started to be formed in Califas and here in Texas, and it was Americo Paredes that really began the whole Chicano Studies program here at UT Austin. So here I was thrust into this, and for the first time learned who I was and what my history was and my literature, and started studying my music, my language. So we found for the first time this pride in who we were and our history. And the Chicano movement was very important, I think, on that level, is that to counter the effects of all of this segregation and racism and, you know, years and years of being doubly colonized, first by the Espanol and then by the United States against Mexico, you know, so lived under first our indigenous language, then supplanted by Espanol, then supplanted by English, and the whole cultural conflict to then sort of a unifying force, a nationalistic movement that was very important in terms of unifying us, even though it didn't succeed on a lot of levels. But more importantly, I think, making us feel proud of who we were and of our history and learning our history, and saying we had to teach this to our kids, you know. So that was very important, the Chicano cultural renaissance then that it became known as.
And there were a couple of key important aspects of this. There was the movimiento songs, you know, Luis Valdez, and all of that, you know. And then there was also the Indígena tradition with maestros from Mexico. Tell me about how both of those influence impact on your own consciousness and your own music.
Well, and you're talking about some very important raíces, if you will, to our culture, to our music, to our literature, to all of our art and cultural forms, and specifically about the indigenismo, going back to our roots, right, and finding out who we were, and that we as Chicanos, right, Mexicans within the United States, were first and foremost American Indians, which, you know, that had been shunned and not taught to us. And even now, people sometimes still think, we're not American Indians, no, Chicanos and Chicanas, the same, because they still are not teaching that in schools for the most part until you get to the college, university level. But anyway, there was this movement of finding out our roots and where we came from. And we in Austin, in fact, became danzantes Aztecas as part of looking for our roots, and not only our historical roots, but our spiritual roots. And then the danza Azteca from some very important maestros, and our maestro in the traditional Aztec dance and ceremonies, the group was known as Xinachtli there in Austin. Andres Segura was a very important figure in the integration of indigenous and Aztec, principally Mexica, Tenochca, spirituality, danza, thought, literature, even though it came from the oral tradition, into the Chicano movement. And there were other people, Florencio Illescas in California also, and other people that those danzantes came. And that influenced our music, our thought, our spirituality, the whole movimiento. We now knew that we had a very important, as Chicano, spiritual, cultural land base to our movement, right? And as then we began getting involved in a lot of political activities, marches, getting organized. We began forming cultural arts centers like Lucha, League of United Chicano Artists, Casa Chicanos Artistas Sirviendo Aztlán there at the University of Texas at Austin. We formed the first Chicano cultural committee at UT Austin. We got involved with Mayo, the Mexican American Youth Organization. We got involved in the Raza Unida Party, the run for governor of Ramsey Muñiz, and worked on those campaigns, got organized within the school and in the community and within the arts and cultural movement, right? Which was very, very important, and took those to the schools. But we became poets, became danzantes, muralists, musicians, formed groups, formed organizations, and that really was my beginning as a Chicano activist, of knowing who I was, and my reintegration of my early arts career once again. After that, I brought the accordion, little old accordion that I had took it up to Austin and began playing it again after all those years, you know. And then within a couple of years, we had formed the Conjunto Aztlán. And the Conjunto Aztlán, from the very beginning, we formed about 1975. There were other antecedent bands that we started there out of poetry groups with Alurista there on campus, and that we had offshoots of doing music and poetry. We were called Inlaquech, you know, the Mayan term, tú eres mi otro yo, our early band, and then Reforma or Revolución, and that led up then to the renaming as we evolved over a year or two to become then the Conjunto Aztlán. And we were very influenced by we became danzantes also. So the danza music and songs influenced the music that we performed in the Conjunto Aztlán. And the Conjunto Aztlán, like I said, was always a conjunto del movimiento chicano because we were created out of the movimiento chicano. And we performed at movimiento functions, brown beret events, fundraisers, marchas, you know, that we were in marches against police brutality, marches for equal education, to get more Chicanos at the University of Texas because we're less than 0.5% when Chicanos comprise 12% of the state, you know, and we were paying taxes too. So in protests and marchas and functions and benefits and barrio organizings, we formed festivals like Chicano Art and Literary Festival within the schools. We had centers, as we said, we had indigenous music, but then when we brought this also, we brought the polkas and the valses, and we integrated popular music with movimiento music, the music that had important social and political messages. We got stuff from across the nation, you know, El Picket Sign, we were doing Al Conjunto over here in our style, that Daniel Valdez and Luis Valdez were doing El Teatro Campesino. We were in marchas for the Texas farm workers strike. We did polkas and changed the lyrics a lot of times to have political meaning, adapted some, wrote our own songs, did teatro with poetry and music and political messages. We believed in what we called the revolutionary aesthetic, that we did not separate art from politics, that we could never do that, and so that our music then had a responsibility to our people, to work with our people, to fight with our people, to work for justice and for liberty and for our land, work for the struggles of the farm workers that were our people and living in very poor conditions. So our songs reflected that. You know, yo soy chicano, yo soy tu hermano, dame tu mano, vamos a volar. Bien dice el dicho, si sangra mi hermano, yo también sangro, la herida es igual, right? El picket sign, you know, La Marcha de los Campesinos, corridos of the Mexican Revolution, all of these things and indicating different problems and what we could do to try to resolve these problems within our community.
So you were doing basically, probably had not thought about it, but through your actions, in effect, you were taking the conjunto, this traditional musical form, ensemble form that you've talked about, you were taking it to a whole other level. You were saying that this music is not just about entertainment, it's about education, it's about pride, it's about spirituality, it's about history, it's about struggle, it's about making this a better world for all of us. That's a pretty profound upgrading of something that Narciso Martinez started 50 years before.
And we were taking our music to this new level in a very conscious way. We knew that we had to do something different and that we were part of this Chicano movement, of the civil rights movement that was for our people, justice for our people, you know, for equality, for justice, for better working conditions, for fighting against these problems, you know, police brutality, the farm workers, equal educational access, you know, all of the problems of the poverty that existed in our communities. We had to sing about those things in our songs and sing about it in our poems and paint them on murals and danza. So very consciously we made that decision we played music with the people and take it not just from very popular love songs and pretty songs and just for entertainment, as you said, but very consciously taken another level, that while they listen to a popular art form, musical form like conjunto is, and playing polkas and cumbias, we added social and political messages to it, very consciously, to talk to our people and say, this is what's going on within our community. We have to do something about it. And not just that, then doing other things, playing indigenous music and showing our indigenous roots, talking about our cultural identity, our cultural and spiritual identity, and our ties to the land, being American Indians here and the first people of this continent, and our history, and teaching our kids and our people and learning with them about our history and our culture, and be proud of who we are, right? Because they used to make us feel ashamed of who we are, and in a lot of ways still do. But all of that was part of our charge as being a conjunto del movimiento chicano. It's not just to have fun and get drunk on Saturday nights. No, we have a much higher responsibility to our people and to our history.
Well, you didn't stop just there, because in 1980, 81, yeah, okay. Well, then I'll change the tape, and I wanna-
Like me needed anyway. We need all the help we can get. Makeup. Nosotros y Michael Jackson. See, we just can't afford all of the implants and the.
You ready? This is roll 2 of interview with Juan Tejeda. So as I said, you didn't just stop with forming the conjunto Aztlan. You got involved with the Guadalupe Cultural Center, and you created the multi-year running San Antonio Conjunto Festival. Tell me how that came about and what motivated you.
Well, my training ground and our training ground happened at the University of Texas in Austin from 72 to 78, and as I mentioned, we got involved on all these different activities and marchas and protests and forming cultural arts centers, Lucha, League of United Chicano Artists, and classes in the community, in the schools. We formed the Conjunto Aztlan, we formed Xinashli, a traditional Aztec dance group. We were poets, we had poetry readings, we were painting murals, we were active in politics and marchas and everything. So this was my training ground, really. When I came back from Austin after I graduated and got my degree in Chicano Studies, when it was still called Chicano Studies, because now it's Mexican American Studies, and make it a little more acceptable to the people, What people? Well, certain people. I still call it Chicano Studies anyway. I came back and then to my hometown of San Antonio after being in Austin for 6 years, and my very formative years in the Movimiento Chicano, and my arts administration experience as an artist, developing myself as an artist, getting my education. And right at that time, they were just beginning to, this whole Chicano cultural renaissance was happening all over the U.S., right? I mean, where Chicanos were, right? So there were arts organizations starting out and community-based organizations all over the place. And here in San Antonio, there was a coalition that had formed to receive for the first time arts money for Chicano arts organizations. We had never gotten money, and they had, given millions and millions to the symphony and to the ballet and to the museums, all white organizations. And Chicanos here comprise, over 60% of the population and paying all the taxes, and we had never received no money. So there was a move, and time was right, because at that point, San Antonio went from an at-large election system, where at best, sometimes only one Chicano was elected, and they were all pretty much white, maybe one black, to a single-member district. They divided up because obviously Chicanos weren't being represented. We were the majority. We only have one out of, 12 city councilmen. So once San Antonio went to a single-member district, and they've divided up into what's called a 10-1 plan, 10 individual council districts and the mayor, the one, Chicanos immediately got like 5 Chicanos on city council, and that changed the whole face, So they only needed one other vote, and that was either the negro or white, and they could get almost anything they wanted, right? So immediately we knew and understood that the politics, so there was a lobbying efforts, and we got together with our Chicano City Council people, said, they've never given us no money, and for the first time then, they began funding a Chicano arts organization. So there were coalitions that developed to ask for money, wrote grants, and one of those coalitions at the time was under the Performance Artists Nucleus. It was a Chicano organization, it was called Performance Artists Nucleus, because they only had, they're the ones that had the 501c3. But it was supposed to become then the San Antonio Consortium for the Hispanic Arts. That got wiped away in a real weird move. But there was like 5, 6 organizations, Chicano arts organizations, that came under this umbrella, asked for money, and got significant amount of money for the first time in the history of San Antonio. I was hired then, right after that, to be, in fact, the mariachi director, because they had asked for money for a mariachi program. And the very first year, even though I wasn't a mariachi, but I had arts administration experience, implemented a mariachi program for the city. And the second year, then I opened it up to all Chicano music. I became the Chicano music program instead of just the mariachi project. But there was a murals project, there was ballet folklóricos, there was a literature project, there was other film and video projects that were involved in this consortium, and other organizations throughout the city that got funded the first year. That organization then, within the next 2 years, became the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. We changed the name, kind of consolidated all these organizations that then into one organization, had different disciplines underneath this one organization that became the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. And I was in on the ground of the first organizing. As soon as they got their first funding, I was hired, and I worked with them for 18 years then, principally as a Chicano music program director, but got involved in all different aspects. I coordinated their performing arts series. We had classes in the community, music classes, but on the different disciplines. It was a multidisciplinary arts organization, one of the biggest in the nation, that really then served as a model for the nation as we grew and as we evolved. And we went like from one year from $250,000 funding to $500-something thousand the following year. And then from that, we developed over the course of 18 years to be like a $2.5 million organization with 24 full-time staff people over the course of the 18 years that I worked there as the Chicano music program director, outside of the first year as the mariachi project director. And I was involved in developing all their publications. I started the literature program there with some money of mine, because I was involved in all these things in Austin, and obviously the music program, and developed and created the Tejano Conjunto Festival, and ran that for the first 17 years, and a performing arts series and publications and audio video production and writing grants and we got a hold of the Guadalupe Theater, and we bought the building across the street, and bought the building that we were in. We broke a lot of glass ceilings for Chicano arts organizations in terms of funding, that major corporations and foundations such as the Ford and the Rockefeller had never given Chicano arts organizations $500,000 for 3 years, you know, and to do some very important projects. And we did a lot of good work, and I feel very proud that I played a role, I think an important role in creating and developing the Tejano Conjunto Festival. And part of that was because obviously I was a conjunto musician, and I knew our history and the music, and that how it had been much maligned, and how still were all these attitudes against it as being this sort of low-class cantina music. So I wanted to showcase it, put it on sort of like a different stage, and not just here again for entertainment purposes. And that's why we developed all these other mechanisms surrounding the Tejano Conjunto Festival, to educate our people about our music, help us feel proud of our music, learn its history. So we do a poster contest where junior high, high school, college, open categories. We had a magazine, we had publications, we commissioned articles, you know, we developed books, we put out cassettes and videos. So all of this from a many-pronged approach to learning about our culture, about our music, about our history, teaching our people and ourselves, and helping us to feel proud of who we are, especially our youth, because they were the ones going to take over. So the Tejano Conjunto Festival then became a very, very important avenue for not only the the dissemination of our music and for showcasing our very important conjunto artists, right? And recognizing those pioneers. And in fact, we developed in the Conjunto Music Hall of Fame to recognize those pioneers within the genre. And of course, presenting the best in conjunto music on, some people said that the Tejano Conjunto Festival in Guadalupe, we took the conjunto music from the barrios and the cantinas to a world stage, right? And I think it's true, and that was part of our plan, was to just to let the world know about, hey, this is our music and it's good music, you know, and this is something we created here in Texas, and it's important not just to us but to the world, and we gave it to y'all, so here it is, and people from all over the world came to it. And
I was going to ask you, what has been the growth? How would you characterize the growth and success from 1980 to the present of the festival?
And the very first Tejano Conjunto Festival was in 1982. Though I worked on a smaller festival, not the scope that I did it in 1981, but the Tejano Conjunto Festival we did in 1982. So now it's getting ready to celebrate its 29th year in 2010, coming up next year, and we're already starting to work on that. I created it and with the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center and other people, and directed it for the first 17 years. And I worked at the Guadalupe for 18 years, then I left. And I left for almost 10 years. And then after 10 years, they've asked me back within the last 3 years to come back and help coordinate it. And I'll talk about that in a minute. But over the period of time for the first 17 years, it grew tremendously, man. I mean, from the first year, it was very successful. It was all free. And little by little, it started charging, you know, because it was a big project. And it went from like a $25,000 project to sometimes over $400,000. So there's some years that I had like $100,000 just for music. We went from a 3-day festival and 18 bands in 1982 to a 7-day festival and 45 bands in 1991 and 1992. Yeah, and then I scaled it back a little bit to like 5 days because 7 days was just too much, man. But and always having theme nights and putting out the publication and commissioning articles and having the poster contest and the Hall of Fame and the whole media thing to really put it out there, man, educate ourselves, our own people, but the whole world about it. So we showcased, you know, women and had different themes, women in conjunto music. Sometimes we had nights at the theater, conjunto music in film and video. Right, we had panel discussions, symposiums, always with the educational man, not just entertainment, right? Because not very much had been written about conjunto music. I remember the very first publication, 1982, that we did, I did an excerpt, I published an excerpt of Manuel Peña's dissertation, doctoral dissertation. He hadn't even finished his dissertation yet. We published an excerpt from it that would later become his book, The Texas-Mexican Conjunto. So even before he came out with the book, we had published already an article from an excerpt from his dissertation, which later became that book. He subsequently published like 3 articles in the magazine that we then compiled into a book, Puro Conjunto. I don't know if you've seen it.
I've seen it online.
A very important source. I'm very proud of that book because when I left, that was the last project I worked on for the Guadalupe. When I left after 18 years, a compilation of 17 years collected writings and photographs and all 17 years of full-color posters from the Tonantzin, the magazine, program magazine for the Tejano Conjunto Festival. So it's a primary source for stuff that's in there that, you know, we had to commission because not that much had been written on it. Well, what do we want to know? What do we want to find? Well, we'd like to study this. Why is this happening? You know, and writers and academics and scholars and anyway, I'm very proud, and it's a very important source of that book. But, you know, conjunto, orquesta, the fusion that existed, we had theme nights, conjunto and country music, that fusion, we had theme nights, because we were doing all that stuff, right? And presenting the best always, you know, in different, you know, conjunto norteño, right? Conjunto meets Cajun Zydeco. We had to try to do different things. So people said, now, you're getting away from your roots and stuff. There was always this criticism that, you know, this is not conjunto music. And I said, well, I'm not, but we're showing the connectedness, you know, the connections that exist between conjunto music and the different aspects. And you can't do the same thing over and over and over. So over 17 years, we went through the gamut, you know, and some very important stuff was done, you know.
But you've also done something very, I think, important, which is, and you've said it, is you put conjunto music and the accordion on the world map in a way that I don't think it's ever been there before, even going back to the Germany and to the polkas and all that. And you know, I was talking with David Hidalgo a few weeks ago. You know, he's on the latest Dylan album.
Yeah,
I told David,
playing the accordion.
I told David, you know, he's downplaying you because you could easily overshadow him, and it's his album, you know. Tell me about the impact that the conjunto ensemble and its use and exploration and elevation of the accordion has done in terms of making that instrument more of an impact on world music.
And I think you're right, that the Tejano Conjunto Festival here, and now coming up in 29 years, and hopefully we're going to be 30 years, and we're already going to start working for our 30th anniversary milestone. And over the course of these almost 29 years that it has existed, and luckily it hasn't died out, or the Guadalupe has not gone under and didn't let that go under, that project. That was very important because the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center has gone through some very hard times, the entire center. We'll talk about that later, but the Tejano Conjunto Festival, I think, played a very important role, as I mentioned earlier, of taking our music from the barrios and putting it on a world stage where then the world really took notice of it. And we had people from all over the world coming in. And in fact, we presented people from Japan. There's a conjunto in Japan. Like, they came to the festival, for instance, just on this one story, you know. A contingent of Japanese, and then we had people from Austria and Germany and from Brazil and from Mexico and Latin America and from Canada. There were all these little pockets of people that would come to the festival, you know, different years, right? But there was this one contingent of Japanese people that came from Japan, like for 3 or 4 years in a row. And then they began playing music over there, and they created a conjunto in Japan. And then, you know, they continued paying them where, and I presented them at the festival various years, you know, which is, you know, pretty amazing unto itself, you know, but conjuntos developed in Spain, you know, playing Chicano conjunto music in France, in Germany, people coming in. I remember people coming in from Amsterdam. They were doing a documentary on the polka and the roots of the polka, the European roots of the polka, and our music, and the connection with the accordion and the polka. So it was very interesting the way our audience, and we still maintained our Chicano base, right, for the most part, but pockets then from all over the US, from California, from Washington, from New York, from Idaho, from Florida, and then the world. So it was sort of it never was a giant festival, and I think we peaked out. I mean, there were some years that we said maybe we had like 25,000 people over the course of 5 days, 7 days, right? 25, 30,000 at our peak. Sometimes less than that, maybe 15 to 20,000. But it was a microcosm of the whole kind of conjunto musical world and fan base from throughout the US, Texas, and the world, you know, in little pockets, which was always very amazing to me, because I'd always, and I still do it now that I'm back, I tell the people, write down where you're from and your names and stuff, and I recognize them from the stage when I'm up there. And I've always kept those, you know, like I have even last year's and from years back. And you go, now I go back to these things and wow, Illinois, right? Florida, Brazil, right? France, Japan, you know, Washington State, from all up and down California, Bakersfield, you know, LA, you know, San Fran, you know, just all over the U.S. It's pretty amazing just in that little, you know, again, just in that little, all these little pieces of papers and cards that are there in the files. But I think beyond that, it's never been a huge festival, but the impact that the Tejano Conjunto Festival has had on our music, on our people, I think on the world's knowledge and education, information and respect, and the changing of attitudes has been huge, right? I think the impact of the festival has been more important than the numbers of people that have come to the festival, because the impact extended far beyond the numbers of people that attended the festival. They took back programs and posters and the media that we generated, articles across the US and world. I mean, we got articles sometimes, you know, from Spain, from France, you know, and we're in magazines over there, from Japan, you know, and the connections that were made that then took back, you know, had a huge impact, and a huge impact on us as a people and a culture in regards to our own music. The attitudes changed, man. We said, hey, with pride now, this is our music, and we're proud of it. Whereas before we're like, conjunto music, you know. I prefer rock, or I prefer Latin jazz, or, you know, that oompa opa, you know, polka music of my parents, you know, and stuff, you know. Like I'm too sophisticated for that. You know, that's old-fashioned. That's my parents' music. No, those attitudes began to change, and amongst the youth, and through the classes, you know, began to change, and they took pride in it now, and they learned the music. And I think beyond that, the classes even had a, you know, there were over 3,000 people that we taught accordion to while I was there, you know, and many of them then became professional musicians and are still playing out there. But just the impact and the impact. I mean, I could go on and on about, you know, the classes, the publications, the media, the, you know.
There's an interesting irony in this. I don't know if it's an irony or if it's just an unexpected and welcome benefit. You know, you grew up at a time when you can remember the discrimination that we as a people, you know, went through. We went through a civil rights movement that helped change that. But something that a lot of people considered innocuous, culture, music, wound up transforming and being transformative of the world appreciation of who we are in a way that is probably even more impactful and more significant than a lot of the laws that were changed. Would you say that? I mean, elaborate on that.
I think so. I think that, you know, the Chicano cultural renaissance and the output as a result of all that, including the Guadalupe Cultural Arts and including the Tejano Conjunto Festival, is a direct result of the Chicano movement and Chicano cultural renaissance, this awakening to our history, our culture, taking pride, and then trying to implement these programs in arts and culture in our communities and how our people take pride. I think that, yeah, and I don't know that anybody has really done a great study of the impact of, like, the arts specifically as a result of Chicano cultural and artistic renaissance, part of the Chicano movement, and the impact that that's had, not just and primarily with our own people, but with all people, you know, worldwide, because it's you know, it's happening at the same time. And like you say, you know, I think that on a lot of levels, our arts and the movimiento and the Chicano cultural renaissance and the offshoot and all the organizations and the programs and the artists that came about, I think it did have more of an impact on our people and in the world in terms of the attitudes towards our people and our culture than, as you say, many of the laws that were implemented, you know, bilingual education and, you know, subsequently that then became the hate crime laws, you know, but started out back then with the police brutality and all of the other legislation that was done for affirmative action. I think that really the arts had a tremendous and very important impact on our people and the world. But I don't know that it has really been quantified or evaluated and measured the way that it should have. And, you know, studies are still being written of that whole period and the continuation. We're here now, 30 years later, you know, we're still here. You know, we're still working, you know, a lot of us cultural warriors, you know, and artistic warriors that were part of the Chicano movement more than 30 years ago, you know, now, what 27, we're going on 40, whatever, no, 70s, 92, 82, 92, yeah, 27 years ago or so, 28, 29 years, we're going to be 29th annual festival here, and 30 years working and more within the arts and within organizations. I mean, the ripple effect of all these years, of all these organizations, of all of these poets, these musicians, murals, and stuff that's going to be here forever. I mean, last year, for instance, I produced 2 live CDs from the festival. I produced one for my students at Palo Alto College. That stuff's going to be here forever, man, you know, that music. We're going to die, you know, but this is going to be here. Our stuff, our hopefully, you know, our tapes, unless they destroy all the computers and all the information systems, you know, this thing's going to be there forever. You know, that's impact, that's history, that's our legacy.
Okay, good. Okay, I think we're done. Good. That was great. Here's what I'd like to do. Okay, continuing interview with Juan Tejeda.
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, that I worked with the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center for 18 years, and I left in 1998 over problems, things that happened anyway. I was up for executive director, but I didn't get it. So I thought it was time for me to move on. I've been there for 18 years, and I went back and got my master's degree, and then I taught at the University of Texas at San Antonio, got my master's in bicultural studies, also a continuation of my Chicano studies degree. And all this time continued playing with the Conjunto Aztlán and working on various projects. But I left the Guadalupe, and then after getting my master's and teaching at UTSA for 2 or 3 years, this position opened up here at Palo Alto College. And I had talked to Dr. Guzman, who had become the new president of Palo Alto College a number of years ago. When she first got here, we threw a party, and I said, you know, what would be great is if, I know that Palo Alto College has a mariachi program, has had one for many, many years, but nobody, not in grade school, not in high school, not at the college or university has ever had a conjunto music program. Great if you could start one. Lo and behold, she put in money for a position to start a conjunto music program at Palo Alto College, the first one at the college university level in the entire United States. And I was very lucky then in 2002 to get that position and began developing and creating a conjunto music program. And I've been there now. I'm starting my 8th year now in this fall semester in 2009. But we've done some very important work as part of this conjunto music program at Palo Alto College here in San Antonio. Developed private button accordion and private bajo sexto classes. We have adjunct faculty, Eva Ibarra, Conjunto Music Hall of Famer Eva Ibarra, teaching private accordion, as well as myself, Chucho Perales, teaching bajo sexto. I developed a conjunto ensemble course where we've developed a student conjunto ensemble called Conjunto Palo Alto. I developed a Tejano music appreciation course, and as part of that, being that my degrees are in Chicano studies and bicultural studies, and I served on the statewide committee with the Texas Higher Education Coordinating Board to develop a field of study in Mexican American studies for community colleges in Texas, and we developed that, and now community colleges in Texas can offer and do offer an Associate of Arts degree in Mexican American Studies, which I also teach, a Mexican American music appreciation course, which is a survey course from indigenous times to the present. So I'm very proud of that. This is also a continuation of my work that began during the Chicano movement, you know, over 30 years ago at UT Austin and the organization we started there, and then serving 18 years as the Chicano music director at Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center, and now directing the Conjunto program and being a professor of music and Chicano studies at Palo Alto College. And we just released our first CD of our students last year. I'm going to give you a copy. I forgot about that. The Conjunto Palo Alto. And in fact, they told me it was the first CD that any of the student ensembles had ever recorded in any of the 5 community colleges here in San Antonio. So I'm very proud of that. And as of 2-3 years ago, the Guadalupe Cultural Arts, I had been gone almost 10 years from the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center. They asked me to come back and help them to once again coordinate the Tejano Conjunto Festival. So I've been working on that with the Guadalupe and still teaching. And I'm very proud of the work that we're doing at Palo Alto College. It's groundbreaking, as the work that we've done, you know, 37 years now. It's like somebody said, you know, well, what happened? You know, the Chicano movement died, and the Chicano movement hasn't died. You know, we're still here. You know, I mean, there's a lot of old Chicano warriors that have been working for going on 40 years or more. You know, that an important movement like that of our people, of our culture, of our identity, of you know, for justice, you know, equality, for the land, for our rights, you know, for our spirituality, for our spirit, for who we are. Those aren't fads that just come and go, man. Those are things that happen and continue to happen and survive because they're important movements. You know, if they're not important movements, then they don't survive. And the Chicano movement's very alive, and you can see it. You know, as you said earlier, I think organizations still exist. The Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center still exists. The Tejano Conjunto Festival still exists. We have now various community-based programs that teach accordion bajo sexto that didn't exist when I first started at the Guadalupe Cultural Arts Center in the Valley. You know, here in San Antonio, we have 3 different organizations. In Houston, other festivals have sprouted all over the United States that were modeled on the Tejano Conjunto Festival. We now have a very important, more comprehensive college-based conjunto program that never existed before. These ripples, you know, are very important. It's a continuation of what we started almost 40 years ago. So I'm very proud of that fact that our work is a testament to our people, to our music, to our arts, to our spirit, you know, and that the movement is very alive, and that our culture is very alive and vibrant, because it was in danger, man, and it always is in danger because it's in constant attack, you know. And it's always a struggle to make our Chicano studies classes, to make my conjunto ensemble get enough students. But, you know, we're there. We're working it every day, you know, and they're surviving, you know, and it's very important. So our work is very important, and I'm glad you're doing this, Chuy, to document this important history of our people and our arts and our music. Thank you.
Good. I want to show you some of that.
Take this off now.
Yeah. So what David